Welcome to our report launch, China's Climate Transition Outlook this year, with the support from Böll. We'll just get started. So this year, our focus is on China's CO2 emissions still increasing, but clean energy surge has also brought the peak closer than ever. And this is about CREA, and you can also find more information about us on our website. And I'd like to briefly talk about China's emissions and its climate commitments. We are looking at a journey of China's carbon emissions. So since the Paris Agreement in 2015, China has been responsible for 19% of the global emission growth in global emissions. That's a huge number. But then around 2013, something interesting happened. China's emission growth started to level off. It's because the economy slowed down and the national anti-corruption campaign discouraged the local governments and together with the National Action Plan against the air pollution, the battle for blue skies. So, however, this didn't last long and COVID shook things up again. Emissions bounced back up in late 2020 and early 2021. What's crucial here is understanding the structural drivers behind these changes. It's not just about the numbers, it's about what's happening on the ground, the policies and the economic shifts and the move towards cleaner energy. And China's climate commitments leave room for a variety of emission pathways. It's like China has several roads that they can take to meet their climate goals. The critical thing to note here is that China's current climate commitments allow for a range of CO2 emission outcomes. This means that depending on the policies and actions China take, the actual emissions could vary quite a bit. For example, you can see the top red one shows the red pathway shows the highest possible emissions that China could follow while still meeting the targets. And there's a consistent effort pathway, the yellow one. This one is more about a steady approach where emissions plateau until 2025 and then started to fall. And of course, there's 1.5 degree pathway. This one's super challenging, but very important. So what we are seeing here is it's not just about setting the targets, it's about choices and actions that follow. And also let me briefly explain the methodology and key indicators we've used in our research. Our research methodology is like piecing together a complex puzzle. We've integrated a variety of climate scenarios from different sources to project China's potential climate trajectories. So this year we've included a new scenarios, broadening our perspectives. And these scenarios have helped us to gauge whether China is on course with its climate commitments and where adjustments may be necessary. It's not just about China's current state, but also about predicting their future path based on solid research. In terms of indicators, which is also a key part of our research, we've identified critical metrics like clean energy capacity and oil consumption, etc., to assess China's climate commitments. So these indicators are compared against the historical trends and also future climate model predictions. This allowing us to evaluate China's current trajectory. We've set benchmarks for each indicator based on various climate transition scenarios. This approach helps us analyze specific areas against expected progress in these scenarios. It's a forward-looking method that gives us a clearer picture of China's journey, moving beyond the simple annual emissions analysis. And Lori?
Thank you, Cixin. So the different sectors that we're covering include electricity, industry, buildings, and transport, and then, of course, the total for the entire economy. We're looking at indicators such as CO2 emissions, fossil fuel consumption, clean energy production, energy consumption, total energy consumption, new investments in capacity or infrastructure, new sales, for example, of vehicles, and electrification. So this way we're breaking progress down into a total of about 30 different metrics. So then into the results of this year's assessment. First of all, it's not a good year simply in terms of CO2 emissions. we estimate that in the first 3 months of the year, CO2 emissions from fossil fuels increased by about 6.5%. You can see the acceleration starting from early 2023 in the monthly graph. The growth was driven by power sector coal use, rebound in oil product consumption after the lifting of COVID restrictions, and an increase in coal use for steel. The one sector where emissions fell is the production of cement and other building materials due to contraction in the real estate sector. One important thing to discern is that quite a bit of the growth in power sector coal consumption was because of variations in hydropower availability, which have been quite extreme in the past couple of years. And that's why the affected indicators this year are shown as weather controlled. So we're controlling for these variations. And we project that based on the first 3 quarters of data, the full year emissions will increase by at least 4%. And so China's emissions are already significantly up from 2020 levels at the moment. And that means that in order to get in line with the emission reduction pathways that are consistent with China's net zero target, very significant reductions are going to be required in the next years. The government said in the beginning of the year that they would introduce control of total CO2 emissions and CO2 intensity as a tool to implement the emission peaking and reductions, but unfortunately there has been little progress or clarity on the timeline for that. And there's also been a lack of progress in terms of making CO2 emission data on the province or sector or national level public. The main reason why China's emissions went up this year and have kept going up despite impressive efforts on clean energy is that China's economic growth during and after zero COVID has been very energy intensive, coming from the most energy intensive sectors. And this is also the remedy. There's little scope under the current pattern of growth for technical energy efficiency to improve things, because in industry, the potential is largely exhausted. In other sectors like buildings, there is still potential. The rapid increase in energy demand means that it will be very hard for China to meet the energy intensity target that it has set for 2025 and that it has also included in its Paris pledge. So you would need 5% GDP growth and almost zero growth in energy demand for the next 2 years to meet the target. In terms of carbon intensity target, which is the other key target that China has set for 2025, it's still possible if clean energy growth is maintained or increased, but it's also going to be challenging and important to watch. Then for the good news, this year's growth in clean energy is absolutely staggering. We expect, and most analysts expect, that China's additions of solar power this year will hit 200 gigawatts or more. For comparison, the United States has 150 gigawatts in total. So China's adding more than the entire installed capacity in the US in just 1 year. And that also means that China's annual additions of clean electricity generation are now in line with even the most ambitious emission reduction scenarios. And importantly, they exceed the average growth in electricity demand, which means that if this level of clean energy additions are maintained, there's no space for fossil fuels to grow in power generation, which should bring about a peak in emissions. There was also progress over the past 2 years in reducing the reliance of the economy on construction and real estate, which has been a key driver of China's emissions over the past decade. So construction materials like cement, steel, glass, and so on have come down from their peak in 2021. The economic transition that has taken place is quite different from what we expected, but no less dramatic. So the investment that used to go into real estate has rotated into industrial manufacturing. And much of it into clean energy manufacturing. It's worth highlighting the scale here. We're talking about trillions of renminbi, so hundreds of billions of dollars or euros being invested in manufacturing. So what happened this year is that for the first time, clean energy manufacturing is a key economic driver in China. China is basically building all the manufacturing capacity that the world could need, even in a rapid energy transition for electric vehicles, solar panels, batteries, and so on. And the investment in these technologies is the key driver of overall fixed asset investment this year, which means that it plays a crucial role in meeting this year's economic targets, GDP target, and so on. So we assess that all of the net growth in fixed asset investment this year came from clean energy technologies. This means that these industries have a much higher weight in China's political economy and in China's economy than they used to, and that makes the transition more robust. Back to negative news. Permitting an investment boom in coal-fired power that started last year has continued into this year. China pledged, and Xi Jinping pledged back in 2021 to strictly control new coal-fired power plants, but unfortunately, the exact opposite happened. The approvals of new coal-fired power plants doubled in the 2 years after the pledge. The background to this is electricity shortages that took place in 2021-22 that led the central government to reverse their policy on coal-fired power. However, most of the projects that have been permitted can't be justified by a lack of capacity. They're rather a result of rigid and outdated electrical grid management on which there's been little progress solving. The same picture applies to coal-based steelmaking. The steel sector is the largest emitting sector in China when CO2 emissions from its electricity use are included. And investments in coal-based steel mills have continued. We now assess that by 2025, 40% of China's coal-based steelmaking capacity will be replaced with new units. So aging units replaced with new ones, which is going against the transition that would have to take place in the sector from coal-based steelmaking to electric arc and further into hydrogen-based steelmaking. So these two areas are ones where investments are out of touch with the transition. In transportation, there has been very impressive progress with electric vehicles. This year, electric vehicles will make up 30% of all vehicles produced and sold in China, and their share will go up by about 3 percentage points out of all vehicles on the road, which means that for the first time, they're making a very substantial dent in gasoline demand. However, oil consumption in transport has yet increased significantly this year after the lifting of the COVID restrictions. And there's a lot more that needs to be done here to bring the trend in line with the energy emission reduction scenarios. The last area or sector that we cover in our assessment is non-CO2 greenhouse gases. This is an area where we're not able to make a quantitative assessment because the government does not publish annual data on emissions. In fact, the latest data that they've published is for the year 2014. There was some progress. An action plan on methane was published, but unfortunately it lacked quantitative targets or firm timelines for example, peaking emissions or even reporting emissions. On other non-CO2 greenhouse gases, there was unfortunately no progress. Summarizing policy developments, so obviously policies promoting wind and solar and other clean technologies proved very successful. There was progress on promoting green electricity trading, creating demand for green energy through the emission trading system. A coal power capacity payment mechanism was introduced. This could be seen as a part of a transition for the sector, but right now the main effect will be to incentivize new coal-fired power projects because permitting is not being controlled. So this mechanism makes coal-fired power plants more profitable or less unprofitable. There was some progress on industrial emissions monitoring and reporting in those sectors that are targeted by the EU's carbon tariffs. So it shows the EU's mechanism there working as it's intended. There are also policy areas where we would expect progress, but didn't see clear progress this year. So in terms of controlling total CO2 emissions, or in terms of expansion of the carbon market, there was no announcement of a firm timeline. Similarly for the power market reform, and in terms of public reporting of emissions or energy on the national or provincial level, there has not been progress. Next, Steve will introduce the expert survey that we carried out to gauge how China's experts in China's climate and energy view this year and its developments.
Thank you. This is the second year that we've done this survey. And this year we've expanded our pool of experts from 26 to 89. So this expansion allows for a more diverse and comprehensive range of insights and perspectives. We've compared this year's findings with those from the previous year, and this allows us to pinpoint any major shifts or emerging trends that have surfaced over the past year. Our primary focus lies in uncovering any significant changes, especially concerning specific aspects or challenges in China's climate policies and actions. So our survey this year reveals some encouraging trends in expert opinions regarding when China will peak its carbon emissions. In a significant shift from last year, the proportion of experts who believe China will reach its peak carbon emission by 2025 has increased from 15% from last year to 21% in this year. And on the other hand, those predicting a post-2030 peak have decreased. And this change in expert opinion likely reflects a growing confidence in China. The majority now believe that China is on track to peak its emissions before 2030. However, it's not all about just hitting that peak. There's a concern about the height of this peak. Like the graphic on the right-hand shows, that there's a concern that experts are worried about how high the peak emissions might relative to previous levels. In fact, 15 out of 89 experts predict that the peak level will be at least 15% higher than China's carbon emission in 2020. So while there's a sense of optimism about when emissions will peak, the scale of these emissions at their peak is a crucial concern. It underscores the imperative for China to not only reach its emission peak in a timely manner, but also to manage and significantly reduce the intensity of these peak emissions. And turning to this slide, we are looking at a key question. Has China's coal consumption peaked? So as per China plans, a peak is expected around 2025. Our experts reveals a mix of opinions. 18 experts think it has already peaked, but nearly half aren't so sure. So 30 experts are undecided, linking to the peak to China's future economic and political scenarios. Increasingly, of those who don't believe it's peaked, a significant number anticipates it's happening by 2025. But there's a notable rise in uncertainty too. So this year, 34% of experts were unsure about the peak timing, compared to only 12% last year. So this reflects complexities in China's energy policy and the intricate balance between economic growth, energy security, and environmental commitments. Yeah, and back to Laurie on our conclusions.
Thank you. I noticed that there is one slide missing. We also surveyed the experts' opinion on whether this year's economic challenges have affected China's energy transition, and the majority of them thought that the economic challenges have in fact sped up the transition. There was, of course, differing opinions, but that was the majority, and it aligns with our findings that the economic headwinds, especially in real estate, have in fact resulted in a massive investment boom in clean energy. So To summarize our assessment of the different indicators, we find that clean energy investments are now aligned with the emission reduction scenarios that are consistent with China's goals. Electrification ratio, so the shift to electricity, is on track. Building sector coal use is on track. Steel and cement output is following this trajectory. Construction material sector emissions, so cement and so on, and electric vehicle sales. However, energy consumption across all sectors is growing faster, highlighting the need for economic shifts, shifts in the structure of the economy. And as a result, total emissions still increased this year and increased much more than they should in the emission reduction pathways. Also, investments in coal-based power capacity and steel-making capacity are misaligned with the emission reduction pathways. And to summarize the key developments in 2023, China's CO2 emissions rebounded from the roughly zero growth in 2022. The surge in clean energy paved the way for an earlier peak and brought clean energy additions to a level that enables China to peak emissions imminently if it chooses to. The clean energy manufacturing boom strengthened the economic and political importance of the clean energy sectors. Investments in coal-based capacity accelerated further. The experts grew more optimistic on carbon peaking, and there was disappointing progress on emissions reporting and on non-CO2 greenhouse gases. Thank you. Back to you, Hannah.
Yes, so now we can start question and answers. If anyone would like to start, you can put your questions in the chat or just raise your hand.
Sorry, Dana Heide from Handelsblatt, German Business Daily. Thank you very much for the presentation. That was very insightful. I have a question about how you think China will act during the upcoming COP. From what we are hearing, they are blocking progress in the loss and damage fund, and they are also expected to, make commitments to the 1.5 Celsius goal. But what do you expect? Like, do you expect anything substantial from the COP from Chinese side? And also, do you think engaging in cooperation with China, like Germany does, does it help? Does this help at all? Like, or is China, following its own rules anyways? Like, I mean, they are investing heavily, as you said, in renewable energies. Does it really matter if Germany is cooperating and if Germany wants to have like those climate dialogues and all those formats? Thank you.
On China's positions, I think from looking at the range of emission trajectories that the Chinese leadership has left open for themselves, there's very little willingness to commit to more than what is already on paper at this moment, even if as said, it's likely that China will overachieve the target of peaking emissions. But very clearly, the leadership has wanted to leave space for different, especially economic policy trajectories, and the economy is currently the overwhelming focus. And so maybe paradoxically, it is this focus on the economy that is driving the clean energy investments. I think the area where there is most potential for progress is the target of tripling renewable energy capacity globally, because what we're showing here is that China is in fact making a massive bet on the success of the energy transition in the rest of the world. All of the solar PV, battery, electric vehicle, and so on capacity that China is building needs the rest of the world to speed up its transition in order to make any sense at all economically. So that's the area. And China has already increased efforts, for example, on financing clean energy projects overseas and so on. So that's the area where I see a lot of potential for progress. That said, it is important that China faces questions about those targets where it's clearly not on track. So the global stocktake and the climate summits in general are are a place for countries to try and hold each other accountable for their targets. Or the other question, so the importance of cooperation, I would say that if we look at the motivations of China's clean energy drive, it's very much industrial policy. It's wanting to establish market leadership, technology leadership in these technologies. So I would say that being that competition, putting up competition will help. So if China's leaders see others slowing down, getting blocked in domestic debates, not being able to move, they will feel like they can take it easy as well, and vice versa. I do think communication and dialogues are important. So, for example, there was a very persistent belief over the past couple of years in China that the EU is increasing coal consumption or going back to coal, even though the data and the trends showed the complete opposite, and that showed the lack of communication during COVID. So I think dialogue is important. Communicating, showing what's happening is important, but I think it's hard to see how you can go much beyond that in terms of impact. There are a lot of questions in the chat. Thank you so much for those. I think, Hannah, can we just run through them from the top? Or
so yeah, from Yuji, we have a question about the report mentioning to enable global emissions to peak fast enough, China needs to not only meet but exceed its current emissions commitments. Can you elaborate on what actions are required? Thank you for the question.
Thank you. So the key issue here that we're pointing out is that China's current target still leaves space for emissions to increase by 10 to 15% by 2030 from their 2022 level. And given how dominant China has been in driving up global emissions, 90% of the increase in emissions since 2015, if the emission growth in China continues, it's very hard to see how global emissions can peak, let alone decline fast enough. So from this perspective, it's absolutely crucial that China's emissions peak as soon as possible, and especially given the fact that now China has the ability to peak its emissions simply by maintaining clean energy growth at its 2023 level. Yeah, then there's a question from Panchen at CGTN. Even though the clean energy investment and capacity are picking up, wind and solar utilization hours don't seem to increase a lot. The utilization hours have stayed pretty constant. They're lower than most other countries, but so as long as they're not dropping, the projection that we made holds that the increase in clean energy should enable emissions to peak. It's a feature of China's policy that both wind and especially solar are installed across the country. And this year, the emphasis has been on installing more in the east and on rooftops. So it's not the most favorable locations, but it's the locations that are closest to consumption centers, and so they make sense from the country's overall policy, even if it doesn't give the highest utilization hours. But so I think the broader point here is that even for a grid of China's size, integrating 200 gigawatts of solar, integrating 60, 70 gigawatt hours of wind per year is a challenge to keep up. And that requires a lot of reforms and improvements to the grid. So that's why we are highlighting the importance of the electricity market reform to make sure that the incentives for flexible operation, for flexible transmission of electricity between provinces and so on are in place, because those are the key shortcomings currently in China's electricity system. At the provincial and city level, are any cities leading the pack in terms of emissions reductions? Currently, it's pretty much a competition between all of the provinces. So everyone's attracting all the investment that they can. This year, in terms of solar, Shandong and Anhui stand out as the provinces that have been the most ambitious in terms of their distributed solar programs. And then, of course, some Western provinces have very, very high ambitions on renewable energy side. However, the biggest one, Inner Mongolia, is increasing both clean energy and coal capacity at very high rates. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Titin, do you have any other province to highlight or city?
Because I can't see the.
Okay. And then there's a question from Avery. Could you give more color on why coal use in the steel sector is growing this year, and why experts are more optimistic about steel industry's carbon peaking timeline? So the China's steel sector had a shift to more steel making from scrap in the past couple of years, and more use of electricity. There's quite a bit of headroom within the existing capacity. That was probably driven to a large extent by the high coal prices. So one factor is simply that coal prices have come down. But the overall challenge is that coal in China is quite low cost compared with electricity, and that's why the steel sector lacks an incentive to shift to electric steel making. So that's one area where price instruments are likely needed. And then there's a question of the drop in demand. Do these sectors have motivation to decarbonize or shift to clean energy? I think currently the industry is still investing a lot, as we saw. Investments in new capacity have held up, so they don't lack the willingness to invest. They lack the incentive to invest in the right things. Do you expect any progress on methane at the COP from Angeli? China just issued its methane action plan, and I imagine that they put everything that they're prepared to put in there. But of course, it would be very important to push China at least to say that they are going to start publishing emission data by a certain year. So the action plan says that emission reporting is going to be improved by 2025 and improved further by 2030. But when there's currently no public reporting of emissions, it's hard to say what exactly that improvement entails. So certainly hoping for more progress, but I don't have a clear reason to believe that there will be new announcements or statements. Then there's a question about the call for phasing out fossil fuels. So the background is that China quite reluctantly, reportedly, agreed to the language of phasing down coal in Glasgow. And since then, what has happened is that China's, of course, had this clean energy growth and has had an even higher emphasis on energy security, which then should make it easier for China to agree to phase down at least of fossil fuels. The planning in China on how to get to carbon neutrality and accomplish those deep reductions in emissions after, let's say, 2030, 2035 is not there yet. So I think agreeing to a fossil fuel phase out might be a step too far because of that. So wanting to keep options open in terms of how much do you do with carbon capture versus negative emissions technologies and biomass with carbon capture and so on. And in terms of the optics currently in China, because the political focus is so heavily on energy security and on the economy, then appearing to strike out options might not be desirable, let's say. But I don't see at least any reason why China could not go from a phase down of coal to phase down of all fossil fuels, because for China, obviously coal is the most important fossil fuel, and the whole pushback from especially India, but also China, was that coal was being singled out unfairly, given the fact that China and India rely on coal, while the EU and the US rely more relatively on oil and gas. So, which is of course fair as such. what needs to happen for the industrial sector to reduce emissions. So the part that is already happening that we highlighted is the scaling down of the oversized real estate and construction sector that we can hope will continue. Then if you take out that sector, basically the other major sources of emissions from the industry are demand for electricity from industry, which needs to be addressed on the power sector, and China's on track to doing that. And then there are petrochemicals have been a major source of growth that is much more challenging, and addressing that will require everything from better transportation policies to incentivizing less use of plastic and so on. A much bigger challenge for just about every country. But one thing that will help with the petrochemical and downstream transportation is that a lot of this is feedstock for a lot of this is associated with the bulk heavy industries. So if there's an overall successful transformation away from bulk heavy industry, that will help with essentially all industrial sectors. For the steel sector, there is a specific opportunity. So for the steel sector, what's happening currently is that steel demand is flatlining, or could be even structurally falling, and at the same time, there is more supply of scrap from dismantled buildings, from old vehicles, and so on. And recycling those can replace a lot of this coal-based steel making that is currently the largest source of emissions in China. And steel being the largest emitting sector in industry, that can have a huge impact on overall industrial emissions. That's all the questions in the chat. Thanks so much. There's one hand from Filippo.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Filippo Santelli for the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. I have a couple of questions. One is, since I tend to look everything China related with their internal lens, do you see, and we know how much the coal sector is embedded in the China political structure at all levels, central and local. Do you see the green tech sector gaining more political agency? And what signs of that do you see? The second one is security, because you touched a little bit on that. Do you see a sort of rethinking in China about energy security, which factors the hypothesis of a coal phase down or phase out, for example, in terms of an ideal energy mix? And the last question is about the geopolitical aspect of this. You said China is heavily investing in being able to provide the entire world with a green tech supply it needs for the energy transition. Of course, the United States, but even Europe, have different opinions on that. I mean, the US considered green tech as being one of the key technologies where to get to keep an advantage on China, and Europe also wants to re-industrialize a little bit on that, and we have a probe on Chinese electric vehicles coming. So how do you see this geopolitical thing interacting with the Chinese efforts? Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Fascinating questions. So yes, of course, the coal industry, broadly understood, is incredibly powerful in China. What is clear is that given the current astonishing growth in clean energy and the investments in both new coal mining and coal power, there is going to be a showdown. All of this cannot continue, and so the coal industry will push for slowing down clean energy, and whether that's successful is of course hard to predict. The previous time that this happened, there was an overcapacity situation in coal-fired power around 2015 in China. And at that point, the coal interests successfully convinced the decision makers that clean energy installations needed to be slowed down as well. The only things that we can say is that because of this much higher weight and importance of the clean energy sectors economically, and because currently the CO2 peaking and clean tech has much stronger political backing, it will be much harder to slow down. So the chances are that the outcome is different, but at this stage, no one knows, and that's why it's so important that China receives the message that slowing down now and letting emissions grow for another 5 years is absolutely incompatible with the Paris Agreement and is not acceptable. In terms of rethinking energy security, there have been a couple of very important developments. So China's coal imports have increased very dramatically this year, almost doubled year on year. And that seems paradoxical because there have been such major efforts into increasing domestic coal production. And so that has really shown that traditional thinking in China that coal equals energy security doesn't work anymore. The domestic supply was unable to compete with imports, and imports shot up. And that has meant, for example, that the government said that they want to scale back the coal to chemicals industry expansion, and they want to deprioritize that sector for coal supply. So that was a pretty dramatic shift because the coal to chemicals industry used to be a key part of China's plan to reduce reliance on imported oil and gas. So that was an important shift. And overall, it's clear that because China has fully domestic supply chains in solar, in wind, in nuclear, that those technologies are a part of the overall energy security portfolio. But yeah, that's not to say that efforts on the production side to boost coal, oil, and gas production would be scaled back anytime soon. That's what's happening everywhere in the world right now, that everyone's trying to produce more, but well, hopefully consuming less. In terms of the geopolitics, I would say that the fact that we now have all the supply, or we're going to have all the supply of solar and electric vehicles and batteries in place for a rapid global transition is a good thing. It's a very legitimate concern that so much of it is in China. And so diversifying, creating alternative supply chains, at least for some percentage of the demand in US and the EU is a smart thing to do. That still leaves a huge and growing market outside of the EU and China, in the EU and the US. So I don't think Chinese producers are too worried about that. And also, even in the best case, I think the most that the EU and the US are going to be able to do is diversify their supply rather than completely stop buying Chinese equipment. So there's definitely going to be overcapacity. There's going to be cutthroat competition because China's supply is increasing so fast, and because others are trying to create supply outside of China. But for the consumer and for the energy transition, that's a good thing, because that will drive down prices and speed up things.
Yeah, just to add a little bit that Laurie just mentioned about energy security. Actually, you mentioned about China actually has enough capacity to meet its peak demand. And so the energy sources actually shouldn't be the primary concern about the energy security, but what's more important is the grid development. So what China should do is to make its grid more flexible, and in this way to achieve its energy security. This is also what China has been doing, but it happens very slowly because of all the interested groups and all the provincial governments. They have their own interests. So that's the part that China needs to work on it.
I think we've gone through the questions, and I think that's it, Hannah.
Yep, I think that's it for today. So yes, thank you everyone for joining us. And the report is now live on our website, and you can also contact the co-authors by email if you have any further questions. So thanks very much, and we will see you later.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.